Margaret Ellis had always been the kind of woman who ironed her husband's shirts on Sunday evenings while he read the newspaper. Not because anyone asked her, not because it was expected, but because she loved him. And love, she had always believed, showed itself in the small and quiet things. In the perfectly pressed collar. In the hot coffee waiting on the counter at 6:45 every morning. In the way she learned, over 38 years, exactly how he liked his eggs, exactly which side of the bed he needed, exactly when to speak, and exactly when to simply be there. Warm, present, steady, like a lamp left on in a window for someone coming home. She had given Richard Ellis everything she had. And on a grey Tuesday morning in November, sitting in a wood-paneled conference room on the 14th floor of a building she had never been inside before, Margaret watched a man she had never met slide a stack of documents across a polished table. And in that moment, with a clarity so sharp it felt physical, she understood that everything she had given was gone. She was 67 years old. The fluorescent lights above her hummed faintly. Someone's coffee sat in a paper cup near the window, steam rising in a thin curl. Margaret noticed these things the way you notice things when your mind is trying to protect you from something it cannot yet process. The slight scratch on the table near her left hand. The sound of Gerald Bryce's pen clicking open and closed. The way Richard sat across from her, shoulders relaxed, hands folded loosely, like a man who already knew how this would end. He had known this day was coming. Margaret could see that now. He had been preparing for this. The way you prepare for a chess match, quietly, patiently, moving pieces into position over years, maybe even a decade, while she ironed his shirts, made his coffee, and believed, with her whole heart, that they were building something together. Gerald Bryce was speaking. Margaret heard the words, in fragments. Primary residence, transferred. Investment accounts, structured trust. Retirement funds, sole ownership. Each word landed somewhere inside her chest, and stayed there, heavy, cold. Sandra, her attorney, leaned close and whispered something. Margaret looked at her, and saw the expression of someone delivering news they had been dreading. Sandra had warned her. 2 weeks ago, in her small office with a fern on the windowsill. She had said the financial disclosure was complicated. That Richard's team had been thorough. That Margaret should prepare herself. Margaret had prepared herself. But not for this. 47 years of combined income, gone. The house in Connecticut, where she had planted roses every spring for 30 years, gone. The account she had believed was theirs. The one she had watched grow slowly and steadily over decades. Like something they had built together. Gone. 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 When Gerald Bryce finished speaking, the room fell quiet. And then, from behind Richard, Margaret heard it. Laughter. Soft, controlled, but unmistakable. The kind of laughter people try to hide when they are pleased and failing. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She knew exactly who was sitting there. Derek, Richard's oldest son, 52 years old, confident in the way of a man who had never doubted the world belonged to him. Vivian, 49, cold, precise, a woman who had perfected cruelty disguised as politeness. And Carter, the youngest, 46, the one who had once told Margaret she should be grateful for the life Richard had given her. As if she were something rescued, not loved. All three of them were smiling. Margaret stood. Her legs didn't feel like her own, like she was moving from a distance. She picked up her handbag, took the manila envelope Sandra handed her, buttoned her coat, and walked out. She said nothing. Not to Gerald Bryce. Not to Sandra. Not to Richard, who still had not looked at her. Not even once. Not in the elevator. Not in the lobby. Not even outside, where the November wind hit her face like a quiet punishment. She stood on the pavement and breathed. Around her, the city moved as if nothing had happened. Taxis passing. Pigeons scattering. A woman in a yellow coat laughing into her phone. A delivery man pushing boxes down the street. Life continuing. As if a woman had not just lost 38 years. To a signature. Margaret opened the envelope. Inside, a property deed. And attached to it, with a rusted paper clip, was a key. Iron. Old. Heavy. The kind of key that belonged to something long forgotten. She read the document slowly. The property was in her name. Had been for years. A rural parcel. No structures listed. An address she had never heard before. In 38 years of marriage. She turned the key in her hand. Why had he kept this? Richard was not careless. Every account, structured. Every asset, protected. A man like him did not forget something like this. This wasn't a mistake. This was a decision. Margaret didn't understand it yet. But she knew one thing. Standing there, in the cold, with nothing left behind her, and nothing visible ahead, she was going to find out. She walked to her car, sat inside, quietly, for a moment, then entered the address into her phone. 2 hours and 17 minutes. Highway, then smaller roads, and at the end, an unpaved track. She looked at the time. 11:23. She had nowhere else to go. She started the car. What she didn't know, as she drove away with the iron key resting beside her, was that 2 hours and 17 minutes ahead, behind a rusted iron gate buried deep in overgrown vines, something was waiting. Something Richard had protected for years. Something his children were never meant to find. Only she had the key. Only she was meant to open it. The highway stretched ahead of her in a straight gray line, and Margaret drove the way she had done most things in her marriage. Quietly, without complaint. Eyes on the road, hands steady on the wheel, thoughts kept to herself. The radio was off. She had turned it off somewhere around the third exit, because the cheerful voices, the laughter, the music, felt wrong, felt almost offensive, as if the world didn't know, or didn't care, that Margaret Ellis had just walked out of a conference room with nothing, except an iron key. So she drove in silence, and in that silence, as the city slowly disappeared behind her, and the land opened into empty November fields, and bare trees stretched across the horizon, her mind did what minds always do, when there is nothing left to hold together. It went back, all the way back, to the beginning. She had been 29 years old when she met Richard Ellis. She was working as an office manager in a mid-sized architectural firm in Hartford, Connecticut. Richard walked in for a client meeting. Tall, composed, wearing a charcoal suit, silver just beginning to show at his temples, and carrying the quiet confidence of a man who had never learned to doubt himself. He was 41, divorced for 3 years, 3 children. They lived with their mother on weekends, and with him during the week. At the time, Margaret had admired that. A father who showed up. A man who didn't walk away when things got hard. She believed that about him. For a very long time. Their courtship, if you could even call it that, was simple, efficient. 6 dinners, 2 weekend trips, and then one Sunday morning, in his kitchen, Richard spoke to her the way he spoke about everything else. Direct, clear, like a business decision. He told her they would be good together, that he wasn't interested in wasting time, that he wanted a partner, someone steady, capable, present, someone who understood that real life was not built on romance, but on showing up. Margaret had said yes. She was 29, and she believed him. The wedding was small, 50 people, a private room in a restaurant. A simple dress she bought off the rack. Because Richard preferred things practical. His children stood beside them. Derek, 11. Vivian, 8. Carter, 5. All dressed well. All quiet. All watching her. With expressions that didn't quite feel like acceptance. Vivian cried during the ceremony. Not from emotion. From something else. Something Margaret didn't understand then, but understood perfectly now. That first year, Margaret tried. She tried everything. She read books about blended families, talked to teachers, learned what each child liked, what each child needed. Derek's favorite meals, Vivian's shampoo, the exact position of Carter's nightlight so shadows wouldn't scare him. She showed up to everything. School plays, soccer games, parent meetings. Even when Richard didn't. She never complained. Because she believed something simple. That love is built slowly. Brick by brick. Through quiet effort. 3 months after the wedding. On Vivian's 9th birthday. Margaret spent 2 days baking a cake. 3 layers. Pink frosting. Sugar flowers she learned to make at midnight. Watching a tutorial while the house slept. She carried it to the table. While everyone sang. Vivian looked at it. Then looked at Margaret. And said, her real mother always bought cakes from the good bakery on 5th Street. Because homemade ones never tasted as nice. The room went quiet. Richard said nothing. Margaret smiled. Cut the cake. Served everyone. Cleaned up. And later, sat in the passenger seat while Richard talked about work. And she looked out the window. And said nothing at all. That was the first time. There were thousands more. 38 years is a long time to disappear inside your own life. But invisibility doesn't arrive all at once. It grows. Slowly. In small moments. At dinner tables. Where your voice isn't needed. At holidays. Where your presence is tolerated, not valued. In rooms where you are introduced. Not with pride. But as information. My wife. Margaret. Nothing more. She kept the house. That's how she thought of it. Not something she said. Just something she became. She kept everything running. Schedules. Appointments. Groceries. Repairs. Birthdays. Thank you notes. The endless, quiet work. Of holding a life together. Richard worked. Richard traveled. Richard built a career. And Margaret made it possible. By handling everything else so perfectly. He never had to think about it. Not once. She proofread Carter's college application. She proofread all of them. None of them thanked her. The trips started early in the marriage. She couldn't remember exactly when. Late 80s, maybe. Once a month. Richard would leave, saying it was property maintenance. Something about land. Inherited from a distant uncle. He never explained much. And Margaret never asked. Because she had learned something early. There were parts of Richard's life that were not hers to question. She trusted him. Completely. The way you trust the foundation of a house. You don't test it. You just live on it. And believe it will hold. She never followed him. Never checked his mileage. Never looked through his phone. Never questioned the receipts. Small charges. Gas stations. Hardware stores. A town she didn't even recognize. She saw them. Noticed them. And let them go. Because trusting him was easier than imagining he was hiding something. Now, as the highway stretched ahead, Margaret counted the years. 38 years. Of trips. Of silence. Of not asking. 38 years. Of believing everything was fine. She looked at the deed again. 2 hours north. Her hands tightened on the wheel. She had spent her entire life not asking questions. Believing that what she couldn't see wasn't worth worrying about. She had been wrong. Now, there was only one question left. Not whether Richard had a secret, but what kind of secret he had been keeping for 38 years. And in 1 hour and 43 minutes, she was going to find out. The GPS took her off the highway at exit 47. Margaret had not been to this part of the state in years, maybe ever. The world changed quickly after that turn. The busy roads, the gas stations, the restaurants, slowly disappeared behind her. And in their place, something older began to appear. Quieter. 2-lane roads stretched ahead, lined with stone walls that looked like they had been standing there long before anyone alive today was born. Farmhouses sat far from the road, their winter fields spread wide and empty, like gray blankets under the sky. Bare maple trees stood along the roadside, their branches lifted into the cold air, stripped, still, waiting for a season that had not yet come. She passed through a small town, a general store with a hand-painted sign, a white church, simple, quiet, with a modest steeple touching the pale sky, a diner with lights on, 2 trucks parked outside, a post office so small it looked like a storage room, a library that seemed frozen in time, like it had been built 100 years ago, and simply left untouched. It was the kind of town people drive through, but never stop in. A place where everyone knows everyone, and strangers are noticed. As Margaret drove slowly down the main street, following the GPS, something felt strange. People were looking at her, not with anger, not with suspicion, but with something else. Something quieter, something that felt almost like recognition. An old man sweeping the sidewalk paused and watched her pass. A woman in an apron outside the diner turned her head. 2 teenage boys on bicycles stopped completely, just to stare. Margaret said nothing. She just kept driving. The GPS guided her past the church, then onto a narrower road, and then onto something that barely looked like a road at all. A dirt track, uneven, broken, slowly being swallowed by nature. Tall trees closed in around her, their branches meeting above, turning the light into something thin, soft, and distant. The world grew quieter. Still. Almost too still. She had not seen another car in 15 minutes. Her Honda moved slowly, bumping over the uneven ground, branches brushing against the roof. The trees here were massive, old, their trunks so wide, 2 people couldn't wrap their arms around them. They stood on both sides of the track, silent, unmoving, like guardians of something hidden deep inside. Margaret glanced at the GPS. 400 meters. She kept driving. And then, the road ended. Not suddenly. Not with any warning. It simply stopped. In front of her, there was nothing but a wall of wild growth. Thick vines, dry branches, wild roses. Years, maybe decades, of nature reclaiming what once existed there. Margaret stopped the car. She sat still, engine running, staring at the tangled mess in front of her. And then, she noticed something. Behind the vegetation. Something straight. Something unnatural. Something iron. She turned off the engine, stepped out of the car. The cold hit her instantly. Sharper than before. Heavier. The kind of cold that rises from the ground. From deep earth. From a place that hasn't felt human presence in a long time. Her breath turned into small clouds. Her shoes, thin, delicate, completely wrong for this place, pressed against frozen soil. She moved forward, pushing through the overgrowth. Branches caught her coat. Vines pulled at her sleeve. But she didn't stop. She kept going. And then, she saw it. The gate. It was bigger than she imagined. Tall, heavy, iron. At least 8 feet high. Old enough that time had almost erased its details. Rust covered everything. Deep orange and dark brown, spreading across the surface like a slow disease. The stone pillars beside it were massive. Solid granite. Built the way things used to be built. Strong. Permanent. Unmoving. But even under all that rust, the gate still stood. Strong. Waiting. Margaret stepped closer. She touched it. Cold. Rough. Unforgiving. It didn't move. Not even slightly. She looked at the key in her hand. Then searched for the lock. It was almost hidden. Buried under thick vines that had wrapped around it for years. She pulled at them. Tore them away. Until finally, the keyhole appeared. She inserted the key. It slid in easily. Too easily. As if the lock had been waiting. For this moment. For her. She turned it. Nothing. She tried again. Harder. Still nothing. The lock was frozen. Stuck in time. For a moment. Something inside her sank. Not the deep pain of the courtroom. Not that. Something smaller. Something quieter. The feeling of standing alone. In the cold. After driving 2 hours. Just to find something that refuses to open. She tried again. 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 7 times. On the 8th attempt, she gripped the key with both hands. And turned with everything she had. Something shifted. Deep inside the lock. A grinding sound. Metal against metal. Rust breaking apart. Falling like dust. She didn't stop. She kept turning. Her hands aching. Cold biting into her fingers. And then, it opened. The sound echoed through the forest. Heavy. Loud. Final. 2 birds flew out of the trees above. Their wings cutting through the silence. Margaret stood still. Breathing hard. Staring at the unlocked gate. Then, she pushed. The gate resisted. Groaned. Screamed. Like something waking after years of sleep. She pushed harder. Her feet slipped. She braced herself. Against the stone. And forced it open. Slowly. Painfully. Until suddenly, it gave way. Swinging wide. With a deep, echoing crash. Silence returned. Margaret straightened up. Moved her hair away from her face. And looked inside. And in that moment, her legs stopped. Not from weakness. Not from age. But because what she saw was not what she expected. Not empty land. Not something worthless. Not nothing. Something else. Something impossible. She grabbed the stone pillar beside her. Holding on. Breathing slowly. Trying to understand. How could he hide this? For 38 years. How could he watch her struggle? Save money. Worry about everything. And never tell her that this existed. That this was waiting for her. The gate stood open behind her. The forest quiet again. Still. Watching. And Margaret Ellis, who had arrived here with nothing. No plan. No hope. Just an iron key. Stood at the edge of something she didn't yet understand. But she felt it. Deep inside. Without words. Her life had not ended that morning. It had just begun. The property breathed. That was the only word Margaret could find for it. Standing there in the open gateway, with cold air moving around her, and winter light falling through the old oaks in long pale shafts. It felt alive. Not in a loud way. Not in a welcoming way. But in the way very old places feel alive. With slowness. With depth. With the kind of silence that makes you suddenly aware of how fast your own life has been moving. She stepped through the gate. The ground beneath her feet changed immediately. Outside the gate, the earth had been hard and cold. Inside, it was softer, covered in decades of fallen leaves, pressed together into a thick natural carpet. Quiet under her steps. The trees here were bigger too. Older. Ancient oaks and maples rose around her, their branches stretching high above, forming something that felt almost like a cathedral ceiling made of winter branches. Even the light felt different here. Quieter. Softer. More deliberate. Margaret stood still and looked. The property unfolded before her in a long gradual slope, falling away toward a valley below. Even in November, she could see the dark line of a stream winding through the lower land. The forest stood thick on both sides, unbroken, undisturbed. But in the center, running down from where she stood toward the valley, there were signs that this had not always been wild. Stone pathways, faint now, almost buried beneath leaves and grass and thyme, but still visible, still traceable. If you knew what to look for. Margaret knew. She had spent too many years in gardens not to recognize it. This was not accidental. Someone had designed this. A very long time ago. Someone had stood on this hillside and planned something beautiful. At the bottom of the slope, perhaps 200 yards away, stood the house. Margaret's breath caught. It was stone. Gray fieldstone. The same kind of granite used in the gateposts, fitted together into thick walls that looked as if they had been built for centuries, not decades. 2 stories. A steep slate roof. Some tiles were gone, but the shape remained strong. The lines were still clean against the winter sky. Tall windows. Silvered wood frames. A wide covered porch across the front. And beneath the years, you could still see the carved wooden supports, their details softened by moss and weather, but still there. Ivy climbed over the lower half of the house on one side. Old ivy, thick enough in places that its woody stems were as wide as Margaret's wrist. On the other side, a massive oak tree stood so close to the house that its roots had begun lifting part of the stone path. The whole place was overgrown, wild. Not ruined, but reclaimed. The way old things become wild. When nature is allowed enough time to remember they were hers first. The gardens were gone now. Or almost gone. But even from a distance, Margaret could see their ghost. A rose bush that had gone wild near what must once have been a fence. The faint shape of a kitchen garden, now swallowed by dead grasses and pale dried stalks. Time had taken much of it, but not all of it. And still, the house stood. Straight. Solid. No collapse. No broken walls. No roof caving in. The structure held. Whatever Richard had been doing here, on all those quiet monthly trips for 38 years, he had been doing enough to keep this place alive. Margaret began walking down the slope. Her shoes were completely wrong for it. Court shoes. Thin soles. A city woman's shoes. Worn by someone who had dressed for a conference room that morning. And somehow ended up here. She slipped twice on wet leaves. Caught herself both times. Once on the branch of a young maple growing in the middle of what had once been the path. But she kept walking. The valley was colder. The little warmth of the afternoon sun barely reached here. Her breath came in steady white clouds. Her fingers, buried in her coat pockets, had gone beyond discomfort into that deeper numbness, where cold stops feeling sharp, and simply becomes part of the world around you. She reached the front path. Up close, the house felt bigger, more real. The porch was wide, its boards softened by age and moisture. But not rotten. The wood was dark, dense, weathered by decades. The carved supports were extraordinary. Margaret could see that now. Leaves, vines, small animals hidden in the design. At the base of the left support, a fox. So detailed she could almost count the hairs in its tail. Margaret stood on the porch and looked at the front door. Old oak. dark with age. Iron hardware that matched the gate outside. Beside the door, a single window with thick old glass. The kind that bends light and distorts what you see through it, until it feels less like sight, and more like memory. She reached for the handle, turned it. It moved. The door was not locked. She pushed it open, and stepped inside. The smell reached her first. Not dampness. Not abandonment. Not the rot she had braced herself for. Something else. Old wood. Clean dust. And something faintly herbal. Maybe dried lavender. Maybe rosemary. The ghost of something once placed there on purpose. And beneath that, something she recognized, without knowing exactly why. Something that tightened the back of her throat. Margaret stood in the entrance hall, and let her eyes adjust. The room was dim, but not dark. Winter light came through the old glass in soft pale rectangles, spreading across wide plank floors the color of dark honey. The floors were dusty, but whole. Old-growth timber that had survived a century and a half, without splitting or giving way. The walls were plaster, painted white once, now aged into a warm cream color, with pale shapes here and there, where pictures or shelves had once hung. To her left, a sitting room. To her right, a dining room. A long oak table still stood there, handmade, solid, heavy. 6 chairs placed around it with deliberate precision, as if whoever had last arranged them expected them to remain that way. Straight ahead, a staircase. Beside it, a corridor leading toward the back of the house. Margaret turned first toward the sitting room. A stone fireplace filled the far wall, its mantel carved from a single piece of timber. The hearth was clean, not just less dusty than the rest. Actually clean. Swept. The kind of clean that required intention. Someone had done that. Not years ago. Not decades ago. More recently. Built-in bookshelves lined one wall. Empty now, but beautifully made. The tops curved gently. The woodwork precise. Made by someone who believed books deserved a proper place. 2 chairs sat near the fireplace. Good chairs. Old, but carefully made, covered in faded fabric that had softened into a quiet blue-gray, beautiful in the pale winter light. And above the mantel, where a mirror or painting might have been, was a single framed photograph. Margaret crossed the room, looked at it, and stopped. It was her. She stood very still. The photograph had been taken years ago, without her knowing. In the garden of the Connecticut house. She was kneeling beside the rose bed she had planted, the second summer of their marriage. Her hands were in the soil, her face turned slightly away from the camera. And she was laughing. Real laughter. Not polite laughter. Not careful laughter. The kind that happens when you forget yourself completely. She looked 35. Maybe 36. Margaret stared at her own face, and for a moment, she didn't recognize it, not because she had aged, but because that expression, unguarded, open, unworried, belonged to a woman who didn't yet know what the next 30 years would ask of her. Margaret looked away, then looked around the room again, this time more slowly, and now she saw it, not all at once, but piece by piece. The room was full of her. Not loudly. Not in some strange obsessive way. Quietly. Deliberately. A watercolor painting of the Connecticut garden. A ceramic bowl on the windowsill. The exact blue of one she had admired once in a shop window. And mentioned to Richard. And then forgotten. Or thought he had forgotten. He had not forgotten. He had found it. And brought it here. Margaret sat down in one of the chairs by the fireplace. Because suddenly her legs made the decision for her. She sat in a room she had never seen before, surrounded by evidence she could not yet fully understand, and tried to make sense of it. What kind of man kept a place like this? What kind of love built a room like this? One visit at a time. Over 38 years. And never said a word. What kind of silence held all of this inside it? She did not hear the footsteps on the porch at first. Only when they reached the door. Margaret stood quickly. Her heart jumped. She turned toward the hallway, and saw a woman standing in the doorway. She was elderly. Late 70s maybe. White hair pinned back. A face weathered by outdoor life into something strong. Less like age, and more like endurance. She wore a heavy coat, carried a wicker basket over one arm, and her expression held no surprise at all. As if she had been expecting this exact moment. As if she had known, for a very long time, that Margaret Ellis would one day walk through that gate, on a cold November afternoon, and find her way into this room. "You must be Margaret," the woman said. It was not a question. Margaret stared at her. "I am," she said. Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "How did you know that?" The woman set her basket on the dining table, and began taking things out. A loaf of bread. A jar of something preserved. A small container of milk. Unhurried. Practical. As if this were the most ordinary visit in the world. "Because Richard told us you would come," she said. "Eventually. After he was gone." Margaret did not move. The woman looked at her directly. "He said to watch for a woman in a dark coat driving an older car," she said. "He said she would look like someone who had just lost everything." She paused, then added quietly, "He said when we saw her, we should make sure she understood, that she had not lost everything at all." Margaret sat down again. Slowly, the woman pulled out one of the dining chairs, and sat across from her. "My name is Dorothy Harmon," she said. "I have lived in this town for 61 years. She folded her hands in her lap. "And Richard Ellis has been coming to this property for 38 of them." Margaret said nothing. Dorothy's gaze moved briefly to the photograph above the fireplace. Then back to her. "I think it is time," she said softly. "Someone told you the truth about what this place is, and why he kept it from you." She paused, then glanced once more toward the photograph. "And I think," she added gently, "you already know part of it." Margaret looked at the photograph, at the younger version of herself, laughing in the sunlight, completely unaware. Then she looked back at Dorothy. "Tell me," she said. Dorothy did not begin speaking immediately. She sat in the dining chair with her hands folded over each other, her coat still on, the basket she had brought resting on the oak table beside her, as if this were an ordinary afternoon visit, and not the moment Margaret Ellis was about to learn that 38 years of marriage had contained an entire second world she had never once been allowed to see. The room was quiet except for the faint creak of the house settling around them. Margaret looked at Dorothy and waited. Finally, Dorothy lifted her eyes and said, "Richard came here the first time in the spring of 1987. He had already owned the property for nearly a year by then, though I believe he had been looking at it much longer. The previous owner was an old man named Walter Green. No children. No close kin. When Walter died, the place sat tied up in probate for a while. Richard bought it quietly the moment the paperwork cleared." Margaret frowned. 1987. Dorothy nodded. 3 years after your wedding." Margaret looked down at her hands. 3 years after their wedding. 3 years after she had married Richard and moved into his house and started learning how to fit herself around his children and his schedule and his silences. 3 years after she had begun building a life she thought was shared. "He came alone?" Margaret asked. "Always," Dorothy said. "At least at first. He would arrive late Friday, usually just before sundown, driving whatever sensible city car he had at the time. He'd stop by the general store first. Coffee, bread, bacon. Sometimes books from the little used shop we had on Main Street before it closed. Then he'd come up here and disappear for the weekend. Sunday afternoon he'd leave again. Margaret swallowed. It was all so ordinary in its detail that it hurt more than anything dramatic could have. Bacon, coffee, used books, the quiet routines of a man who knew exactly where he was going and exactly what waited for him when he got there. "I thought those trips were work," Margaret said. Dorothy's expression softened. "I expect he wanted you to think that." Margaret gave a short, humorless laugh. "Yes," she said. "He wanted me to think a great many things." Dorothy did not argue. Instead, she looked slowly around the room, at the fireplace, the shelves, the photograph over the mantel. "This house," she said quietly, "was never just a property to him. It was a refuge. I think it was the only place where he ever allowed himself to be honest." Margaret's eyes returned to the photograph of herself in the garden. Dorothy followed her gaze. "He brought that one in 1996, she said. "Came into the store with it tucked inside a book so the frame wouldn't scratch. He asked me what I thought of putting it there above the fireplace. Said it was the first picture of you he'd ever taken without you noticing. He was absurdly pleased with himself about it." Margaret stared at her. "He talked about me?" Dorothy smiled sadly. "Almost constantly." The words landed harder than Margaret expected. For a moment she could not answer. She had spent so many years with Richard's silence, with his careful reserve, with his maddening ability to keep whole sections of himself sealed away, that the idea of him speaking freely, speaking warmly, about her to someone else felt almost more painful than comforting. "What did he say?" she asked at last. Dorothy leaned back slightly in the chair. "He said you made beautiful things grow," she said. "He said you could walk into any house and make it feel inhabited within a week. He said you laughed with your whole face when you forgot to be guarded. He said your hands never stopped moving, that even when you were sitting still, one hand would be smoothing a napkin or straightening a stack of books or touching the edge of your teacup like you were keeping the world in order just by noticing it." Margaret's throat tightened. There were tears rising now, but they were different from the tears she had cried in the car outside the courthouse, or standing in her empty driveway after Richard left, or lying awake through the slow collapse of her marriage. Those tears had come from humiliation, from grief, from being erased. These came from something more dangerous, from being seen. Dorothy's voice softened further. "He said you were the only place in his life that ever felt like home," she said. Margaret shut her eyes. For a moment she could not breathe properly. If Richard had said that to her once, even once aloud, perhaps everything would have been different. Or perhaps not. Perhaps men like Richard built their emotional lives in hidden rooms and locked the doors from the inside and called it necessity. When Margaret opened her eyes again, Dorothy was watching her with the patience of someone who understood that certain truths require a moment to land. "Then why?" Margaret asked. "Why keep this place from me? Why let me live all those years not knowing? Why leave me to stand in that courtroom this morning and think he had left me with nothing?" Dorothy was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Because he was afraid," she said at last. "Of them. Of what they would do if they ever knew this place existed." Margaret's eyes sharpened. "The children." "Yes." Dorothy's mouth tightened. "Richard never spoke cruelly of them, not exactly. But he spoke plainly. He knew what they were. He knew their greed. Knew their resentment toward you never faded, only changed shape as they got older. He believed that if they discovered this property while he was still alive, they would challenge it, poison it, attach themselves to it in whatever legal way they could manage." Margaret thought of Derek's smug face in the conference room, of Vivian's thin smile, of Carter's polished cruelty. Yes, she thought, they would have. "He had lawyers handle the deed work years ago," Dorothy continued. "Quietly. Very quietly. He told me that if anything happened to him, the property would already be beyond challenge, or as close to beyond challenge as a good lawyer can make anything in this world. He said they would chase visible money. Houses in town. Accounts. Stocks. Things they could count and divide and brag about. But a forgotten property behind a rusted gate in the woods? He believed their greed would blind them to anything that looked like inconvenience. Margaret let out a long, unsteady breath. "And the letter?" she asked. "You said there was one." Dorothy nodded and rose from her chair. She crossed the room to the mantel and reached behind the framed photograph. For a moment Margaret could not understand what she was doing. Then Dorothy drew out an envelope, cream-colored, thick, sealed with dark red wax. Margaret's heart started pounding. Her name was written across the front in Richard's unmistakable hand. Not Margaret Ellis. Not Margaret. My Margaret. Dorothy brought it to her and placed it gently in her lap. "He left instructions with me," Dorothy said. "Very specific ones. If you came alone, I was to give you the basket first, let you sit down, let you see the room, and then only when you asked the right question was I to give you this." Margaret looked up. What was the right question? Dorothy's eyes glistened. "Why?" she said. "He knew that would be the first real thing you'd ask." Margaret lowered her gaze to the envelope. The wax seal trembled slightly in her hands because her hands were trembling. "What's in it?" she whispered. Dorothy looked toward the hallway, toward the back of the house, toward somewhere Margaret had not yet explored. "The beginning of the truth," she said. "And directions to the rest of it." Margaret ran her thumb over the edge of the envelope. Outside, the winter wind moved softly through the trees. Inside, in the house her husband had hidden from her for 38 years, with a sealed letter in her lap and a woman across from her who seemed to know more than she was yet saying, Margaret Ellis understood that the gate had not been the real door. This was. And whatever waited inside Richard's final words was about to change everything. Margaret did not open the letter right away. She held it in her hands, feeling the weight of it, the thickness of the paper, the slight unevenness where the wax seal had been pressed years ago. It was strange how something so small could feel heavier than everything she had carried out of that courtroom. Dorothy did not rush her. The house was quiet again, the kind of silence that seems to wait with you. Margaret traced the handwriting with her thumb. My Margaret. He had never called her that out loud. Not once in 38 years. Her chest tightened. Slowly, carefully, she broke the seal. The sound was soft, but it felt final. She unfolded the letter. For a moment, the words blurred. Not because they were unclear, but because her eyes refused to steady. She blinked, took a breath, and began to read. If you are reading this, then I have already failed you in the one way that matters most. I have spent a lifetime knowing how to build things, and an equal lifetime not knowing how to say what I feel. So I am writing this instead. Margaret's fingers tightened slightly on the paper. That sounded like him. Too much like him. You deserved a husband who spoke. A man who told you what you meant to him while you were standing in the same room. I was not that man. I told myself there would be time. That I would find the right moment. That I would say it when it mattered most. But the truth is, it always mattered. And I said nothing. A tear slipped down Margaret's cheek. She did not wipe it away. This place, this house, was never meant to be a secret from you. It was meant to be a gift. The only place I ever built with you in mind. Even when you weren't here. Margaret's eyes lifted slowly from the page. She looked around the room again. The photograph. The bowl. The small details she had not fully understood before. He had built this place for her. Every month I came here, I tried to create something I did not know how to create at home. Peace. I thought, if I could build it here first, I might learn how to bring it back with me. Margaret let out a shaky breath. But you never did, she whispered. Dorothy said nothing. I failed at that. Not because I didn't want to, but because I was afraid. Afraid of conflict. Afraid of losing control. Afraid of what would happen if I disrupted the life I had already built. So I chose silence. And silence is not neutral, Margaret. Silence is a decision. Margaret closed her eyes. For the first time, she understood. Not accepted. Not forgiven. But understood. The children. I know what they are. I know how they see you. And I know what they would do if they ever found this place. That is why everything here is in your name. Not mine. Not theirs. Yours. Her heart began to race again. The letter trembled slightly in her hands. They will come after you. They will try to take what they believe belongs to them. Let them. Because there is something they don't know. Margaret's breath caught. Her eyes moved faster now. The real value of this property is not the land. It is what is hidden beneath it. Margaret looked up sharply. Dorothy met her eyes, but still said nothing. There is a room below the house. A stone room, older than the structure itself. You will find the entrance through the back corridor, beneath the staircase landing. There is a panel in the wall. It opens if you press the lower right corner. Margaret's pulse was loud in her ears now. Inside that room, you will find everything I never said out loud. And everything you will need. Her hands tightened around the letter. Documents. Proof. Records I kept over the years. Not for revenge, but for protection. Margaret's jaw slowly clenched. Now she understood. If they challenge you, if they try to take this from you, do not argue. Do not explain. Just show them. A long silence filled the room. Margaret lowered the letter slightly. Her entire body felt different now. Not broken. Not empty. Something else. Something steady. There are also letters. One for every year we were married. I wrote them here, when I couldn't say the words at home. Margaret stopped breathing. Her eyes returned to the page. You may not want to read them. You may hate me too much. You may never forgive me. You would be right to do so. Her vision blurred again. This time she did wipe the tears away. But if you do read them, you will know the truth. Not the version I showed the world. Not the man you lived beside. The truth. The paper trembled in her hands. I loved you. I just did not know how to live that love out loud. Margaret closed her eyes. That was it. That was the sentence she had waited 38 years to hear. And it had arrived too late. This place is yours. Not as compensation. Not as apology. But as something that was always meant to belong to you. Her breathing slowed. You gave me a home. I am giving you one back. The final line. Richard. Margaret lowered the letter into her lap. The room was silent again. But it did not feel the same. Nothing felt the same. For a long moment, she did not move. Then, slowly, she stood. Dorothy watched her carefully. Well, she asked softly. Margaret looked toward the hallway. Toward the back of the house. Toward the place Richard had written about. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm. Stronger than it had been all day. He wasn't done, she said. Dorothy nodded. No, she replied. He wasn't. Margaret folded the letter carefully. Not rushed. Not angry. Not desperate. Deliberate. Then she turned toward the corridor. Her footsteps were steady now as she walked past the staircase, toward the hidden panel Richard had described. Toward the stone room. Toward the truth he had buried beneath everything else. And this time, she wasn't afraid of what she might find. She was ready. The corridor behind the staircase was narrower than the rest of the house. Margaret moved slowly, her hand brushing lightly against the wall as she walked, as if the contact might steady her, or confirm that this place was real. The air felt different here. Cooler. Still. The kind of stillness that belongs to spaces that have not been opened often. Behind her, she could hear Dorothy's footsteps, quiet, measured, not interfering. Margaret reached the base of the staircase landing. She stopped. For a moment, nothing looked unusual. Just a plain section of wall. Cream-colored plaster. Slightly aged. Slightly uneven. But now she was looking differently. Now she knew something was hidden here. She stepped closer. Her eyes moved slowly across the surface, until they found it. A faint outline. A square, barely visible unless you were searching for it. Her heart began to pound again. She reached out her hand. Lower right corner. Just like the letter had said. For a second, she hesitated. 38 years of silence had led her here. Everything she believed, everything she had lost, everything she had just learned. All of it was about to open. Margaret pressed the corner. A soft click. The sound was small, but it echoed in her chest. The panel shifted slightly inward. Dorothy stepped forward and gently helped her pull it open. Behind it, darkness. Not empty darkness. Deep darkness. A narrow stone staircase descended below the house. Margaret stared at it. The air rising from below was colder, heavier, carrying the faint scent of damp stone, and something else. Something old. Something preserved. Richard built this entrance later, Dorothy said quietly. The room itself was always there. Older than the house. He just made sure only you could find it. Margaret swallowed. Of course he did. She stepped forward. The first step creaked under her weight. Then the second. Then the third. Each step took her deeper into something that no longer felt like a secret, but like a truth that had been waiting patiently for her. The staircase curved slightly as it went down, the light from above fading with every step until Dorothy reached forward and pulled a cord on the wall. A single bulb flickered on below. Dim. Yellow. Barely enough. But enough. Margaret reached the bottom. And then she stopped. The room was larger than she expected. Stone walls. Thick. Solid. Cool to the touch. The ceiling low but stable, supported by heavy wooden beams darkened with age. And inside it, everything was organized. Not abandoned. Not chaotic. Deliberate. Against one wall, shelves. Wooden shelves lined with boxes. Dozens of them. Each labeled neatly in black ink. Dates. Years. Names. Margaret's breath caught. On another side, metal filing cabinets. Locked. But not sealed. And in the center of the room, a large wooden table. On it, stacks of papers. Bound. Sorted. Prepared. Margaret stepped forward slowly. Her fingers hovered over the nearest box. She read the label. 1992. Next one. 1998. Then she froze. Derek Ellis, Financial Records. Her chest tightened. Another box. Vivian Ellis, Accounts and Transfers. And another. Carter Ellis, Legal Correspondence. Margaret felt something shift inside her. Something sharp. Something awake. This, she whispered. Dorothy stepped beside her. He knew, she said quietly. Long before you did. Margaret opened the first box. Inside, files. Bank statements. Copies. Highlighted sections. Notes written in Richard's handwriting. Precise. Cold. Clear. Unauthorized transfers. Hidden accounts. Money moved quietly, over years. Margaret's hands began to tremble again, but this time, not from weakness. From realization. They've been stealing, she said slowly. Dorothy nodded. For a very long time. Margaret picked up another document. Then another. The pattern was undeniable. Careful. Intentional. Hidden beneath layers of legality, but not invisible to someone who was looking. And Richard had been looking. 4 years. He was building this, Margaret said. Dorothy corrected her gently. No, she said. He was protecting you. Margaret looked up. The words landed differently now. Protecting her. Not from strangers. From his own children. Margaret turned slowly. Her eyes fell on something else. In the far corner of the room. Separate from everything. A wooden chest. Old. Worn. But carefully kept. She walked toward it. Each step slower than the last. She already knew. Even before opening it. Her hands rested on the lid. For a moment, she just stood there. Then she lifted it. Inside, letters. Stacks of them. Dozens. Tied together in bundles. Each one labeled in the same handwriting she had just read upstairs. Years. Dates. Her name. Margaret's breath broke. She picked up the top letter. 1988. The first year. Her fingers traced the edge. 38 years. 38 letters. Every year he had said nothing. He had written something. Margaret sat down slowly on the edge of the chest. The room felt different now. Not cold. Not empty. Full. Heavy with everything that had never been spoken. Behind her, Dorothy said nothing. She didn't need to. Margaret held one of the letters in her hands, but she didn't open it yet. Not yet. Because now she understood something even deeper. This room wasn't just proof. It wasn't just protection. It was a confession. Layer by layer. Year by year. A life that had been hidden. Not from the world, but from her. Margaret closed her eyes. Took a slow breath. Then she looked back at the shelves. At the files. At the evidence. At the letters. And for the first time since that courtroom, she didn't feel lost. She felt prepared. Because now, she had the truth. And the next time they came for her, she wouldn't be the woman they thought she was anymore. They didn't wait long. Margaret had expected days, maybe weeks. But it was only 4. 4 days after she opened the stone room, 4 days after she read the first 3 letters, 4 days after something inside her shifted from quiet endurance into something steady and unbreakable. They came. Dorothy was the one who saw the cars first. "Black sedan," she said from the window, her voice calm. "And another one behind it." Margaret didn't rush. She stood in the sitting room, the letter from 1994 still open in her hands. She read the last line again, slowly, then folded it with care and placed it back into its bundle. Outside, gravel crunched under tires. Doors opened. Voices. Confident. Sharp. Familiar. Margaret exhaled once. Steady. "They're early," she said. Dorothy glanced at her. "People like them usually are." Margaret nodded. Then she walked to the door. Not hurried. Not hesitant. Deliberate. When she opened it, they were already on the porch. Derek stood in front, just as she remembered, broad, solid, carrying himself like a man who believed every space he entered already belonged to him. Vivian stood slightly behind him, arms crossed, her expression tight with irritation. Carter lingered near the steps, composed, watchful, calculating. And behind them, a man in a dark coat. Lawyer. Of course. Margaret looked at them, and for the first time in 38 years, she didn't feel small. "Margaret," Derek said, his tone already edged with authority. "We need to talk." Margaret stepped aside. "Then come in," she said calmly. They entered without hesitation. Their eyes moved quickly across the room. The fireplace. The shelves. The photograph. Margaret noticed the exact moment it hit them. This wasn't worthless land. This wasn't abandoned. This was something else. Something valuable. Something they had missed. Vivian's voice cut through the silence. "So this is it," she said. "This is what he hid." Margaret closed the door behind them. "Yes," she replied. "It is." The lawyer stepped forward. "Mrs. Ellis," he said politely, "my clients believe this property falls under marital asset distribution. Given the timing and nature of the ownership, there are grounds to contest." Margaret raised her hand. Not aggressively. Just enough to stop him. "No," she said. The room went still. The lawyer blinked. "No," she repeated. "There aren't." Derek's jaw tightened. "You don't get to decide that." Margaret met his eyes. "For 38 years," she said quietly, "I didn't decide anything." Silence. Heavy. different. But I do now. Carter stepped forward slightly, voice smooth. Let's not make this emotional. We're just asking for what's fair. Margaret almost smiled. Fair. The word sounded unfamiliar in his mouth. Fair, she repeated softly. All right. She turned, walked to the table, and picked up a folder. Thick, organized, prepared. She placed it in front of them. Before we talk about what's fair, she said, you should look at that. Derek didn't hesitate. He opened it, and everything changed. His confidence cracked first. It was small, almost invisible, but Margaret saw it. Then Vivian leaned in. Then Carter. Pages turned. Faster now. Eyes moving. Scanning. Realizing. Statements. Transactions. Transfers. Their names. Their signatures. Their patterns. Years of it. Hidden. But not hidden enough. Derek's face lost its color. This is, he started. Accurate, Margaret said. Carter straightened slowly. Where did you get this? Margaret's voice didn't rise. I didn't, she said. Your father did. Silence fell like a weight. The lawyer reached for the file, flipping through it with a different kind of attention now. Slower. Focused. Careful. He knew what he was looking at. And more importantly, he knew what it meant. This changes things, he said quietly. Vivian's voice cracked slightly. This doesn't prove anything. It proves enough, the lawyer interrupted. That shut her up. Margaret watched them. Not with anger. Not with revenge. Just clarity. For years, she said, you took what wasn't yours. Quietly. Carefully. Believing no one was paying attention. Derek clenched his jaw. You're bluffing. Margaret shook her head. No, she said simply. I'm finished. That word landed harder than anything else she could have said. Finished. Not arguing. Not begging. Not explaining. Done. She stepped closer. Not aggressive. But present. You can take this to court, she continued. You can fight me. You can try to take this place. She paused. Let the silence stretch. Then. But if you do, this goes with it. Her hand rested lightly on the folder. The message was clear. Crystal clear. The room shifted. The power shifted. Completely. Carter was the first to step back. Vivian followed. Derek stayed still a moment longer, then slowly closed the file. His hands were no longer steady. The lawyer cleared his throat. I would advise, he said carefully, that we reconsider our position. No one argued, because there was nothing left to argue. Margaret walked to the door, opened it, not forcefully, not dramatically, just final. Derek looked at her. For the first time, really looked at her, as if seeing someone new. This isn't over, he said. Margaret met his gaze. Yes, she said calmly. It is. One by one, they left. The cars pulled away. The sound of gravel faded. Silence returned. Margaret stood at the doorway for a long moment. Then she closed it. Softly. Behind her, Dorothy exhaled. Well, she said quietly. That went differently than I expected. Margaret didn't turn. She looked at the room. At the life inside it. At the truth she now carried. They thought I had nothing, she said. Dorothy smiled faintly. And now? Margaret's voice was steady. Now, she said, I have everything they were afraid of. And for the first time in a very long time. That was enough. The silence after they left felt different. Not empty. Not heavy. Settled. Like something that had been waiting a long time, had finally found its place. Margaret stood near the doorway for a few seconds longer, listening to the fading sound of the cars, until even that disappeared. Then she turned back inside. The house felt warmer. Or maybe she did. Dorothy had already moved toward the kitchen, as if instinctively returning the world to something normal. The soft clink of dishes, the quiet movement of someone who understood that life doesn't stop after a storm. It resets. Margaret walked slowly into the sitting room. Her eyes moved across everything again. But this time, she wasn't discovering it. She was choosing it. She walked to the shelf and picked up one of the letters. 2003. She opened it, sat down, and began to read. You would have liked the light here today. It came through the trees in a way that reminded me of the mornings you used to spend in the garden, before the house woke up, before the world needed something from you. Margaret's lips pressed together. He remembered that. Of course he did. I tried to grow something again this year. Not roses. I don't think I ever understood them the way you did. But there's a patch near the south side where the ground stays warm longer. I planted herbs. Most of them didn't survive. But a few did. Margaret glanced toward the window. Toward the overgrown edge of what must have once been that same patch. I suppose that's the difference between us. You knew how to nurture things. I only knew how to build structures around them. Margaret let out a slow breath. That was true. Painfully true. If you were here, you would fix this place in ways I never could. You would see what it wants to become. Margaret's eyes closed briefly, then opened again. Stronger. Clearer. She folded the letter carefully and placed it beside her. Then she stood, and for the first time, she began to move through the house not as a visitor, but as its owner. The next few days passed quietly. Not empty, but full in a different way. Margaret woke early. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She walked the land. Every morning. Slowly at first, learning its shape, its rhythm. The slope from the gate. The path to the stream. The places where sunlight touched first, and the places where it stayed longest. She noticed everything. The way the ground softened near the lower field. The way the old trees leaned slightly, as if they had grown together for decades. The broken edges of what used to be a garden. And she began, gently, to change things. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just small things. She cleared a section of the path. Pulled back the vines near the gate. Opened windows in the house to let the air move through again. Each action quiet. Deliberate. Alive. Dorothy watched her sometimes. Not interfering. Just observing, with the kind of quiet approval that doesn't need words. You're bringing it back, she said one afternoon. Margaret shook her head softly. No, she replied. I'm just continuing it. The letters became part of her routine. Not all at once. One at a time. 1 year at a time. Some were short. Some longer. Some filled with details of the house, the land, the repairs he made. Others, more personal, more fragile, more honest than anything Richard had ever said out loud. Margaret didn't rush them. She let them sit with her. Let them settle. Some made her cry. Some made her angry. Some made her understand things she wasn't ready to understand before. But all of them moved something inside her. One evening, near sunset, she walked back to the gate. It was still rusted, still old, but now it stood open. Not forced, not broken, open. She placed her hand on the iron. Cold, familiar, and she realized something. This gate had not been the end of her life. It had been the beginning. She had just never known it. Behind her, the house stood quiet and steady. Not abandoned. Not forgotten. Waiting. And now, alive again. Margaret looked out beyond the trees. For a long moment. Then she turned back. Walked inside. Closed the door behind her, not to shut the world out, but to finally create something within it. Something that was hers. Not borrowed. Not tolerated. Not temporary. Hers. And for the first time in a very long time, she wasn't surviving. She was living. 6 months later, the gate looked different. Not new. Not perfect. But cared for. The rust was still there in places, stubborn and honest, but much of it had been cleaned away. The iron now carried a dull, quiet shine, like something that had not been replaced, but restored. Margaret stood in front of it with a cup of coffee in her hands. Steam rose slowly into the cool morning air. The same gate. The same place. But not the same woman. The road leading up to the property was no longer hidden. Gravel had been laid. The wild growth cut back just enough to let the path breathe again. Not tamed. Just respected. A small wooden sign stood near the entrance now. Simple. Hand-painted. Ellis Retreat. Margaret hadn't planned the name. It had come to her one morning while she was reading one of Richard's letters, and for the first time, his name didn't feel heavy. It felt complete. The house behind her had changed too. The structure was the same, stone, steady, unshaken by time. But now there was life inside it again. Windows open. Curtains moving gently with the breeze. The scent of something warm drifting from the kitchen. Voices, sometimes, soft, careful, healing. Women had started arriving 3 months ago. Not many at first. 1, then 2, then 5. Each one carrying her own version of loss. A divorce. A betrayal. A life that had quietly collapsed without warning. Margaret didn't advertise. Didn't promote. She simply opened the space. And somehow, the right people found their way there. Dorothy called it the way some places work. Margaret didn't argue, because she had been one of those people. Lost. With nowhere to go. Until something led her here. She took a slow sip of her coffee and looked out at the land. The lower field now held a small garden. Not perfect. Not finished. But growing. She had planted herbs first. Just like Richard had once tried. This time, they survived. More than survived. They thrived. Behind her, the front door opened. Footsteps approached softly. "You're out here early again," Dorothy said, wrapping a shawl tighter around her shoulders. Margaret smiled slightly. "I like the quiet." Dorothy nodded, standing beside her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. "Do you ever think about him?" Dorothy asked gently. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She looked at the gate. At the iron. At the road beyond it. At the life she had left behind. Then, she nodded. "Not the way I used to," she said. Dorothy waited. Margaret exhaled slowly. "I used to think he took everything from me." A pause. "Now I understand. He was giving something back." Dorothy smiled. Not wide. Just enough. Margaret set her empty cup down on the wooden post beside the gate. Then she reached out, and ran her fingers lightly over the iron. 6 months ago, this gate had been closed. Heavy. Unmoving. A barrier. No. It stood open. Every day. More footsteps approached from behind. Voices. Soft laughter. One of the women, Sarah, recently arrived, still carrying that fragile look of someone who hasn't yet learned how to stand steady again, stepped onto the porch. She hesitated, then looked toward Margaret. "Is it okay if I walk down to the stream?" she asked. Margaret turned. Smiled. "Of course," she said. "It's yours too." Sarah nodded, a little unsure, but hopeful. And then she walked past the gate. Not as someone lost, but as someone beginning. Margaret watched her go. Then she looked back at the house. At the open windows. At the quiet movement of life inside it. At everything this place had become. Not because of Richard. Not because of the past. But because of what she chose to do with it. She picked up her cup again. Walked slowly back toward the house. The gravel crunching softly under her feet. The morning light stretching across the land. Everything calm. Everything steady. At the door, she paused. Just for a second. And looked back one last time. At the gate. At the road. At the woman she had been, standing there months ago, with nothing but a key and a question. Then she smiled. Softly. Knowingly. And stepped inside. Closing the door behind her, not to shut the world out, but to finally live within one that was hers. Fully. Completely. And without fear. Because in the end, she hadn't lost everything. She had only been led home.